I have been a radiation physicist for 23 years, and in that time I have stood inside enough reactor chambers to know what real danger smells like. It smells like hot metal and ozone and the particular sharpness of a Geiger counter clicking faster than it has any right to. I know that smell the way a diver knows the pressure change at 30 meters, not intellectually, but in the body, in the small hairs on the back of the forearm, and the slight tightening at the base of the skull that says, "Pay attention." What I was not prepared for on that gray October morning when Major Cartwright rang my office before dawn and told me to come out to Drumhaven Moor with my instruments was the smell of something older than any reactor, something that had been waiting underground for a very long time, that, I would discover, had been waiting for someone to notice it was there. I will tell you what happened, not the official version that was filed in triplicate and buried in an Atomic Energy Commission archive, and does not in any meaningful way tell you what happened. The official version is accurate in its facts and dishonest in its silence. I have spent 20 years deciding whether to be bothered by that, and I have concluded that I am, somewhat, and that the conclusion does not change the official version. So, I might as well tell the truth, here where it belongs. The call came at 5:30. I was already at my desk. I kept strange hours even then, the product of too many years when sleep was a luxury deferred to the end of problems. And the problems rarely ended cleanly. Cartwright's voice on the line had that particular flatness of a man suppressing the fact that he has no idea what he is dealing with, and is concealing this from himself as much as from me. "Crack in the ground," he said. An explosion from below during a routine training exercise on the moor. 3 men with radiation burns, one of them quite serious, and a fissure in the moorland that his engineers said went deeper than their survey equipment could measure. He said it the way military men say things they do not believe, holding the facts at arm's length, as if proximity to their strangeness might be catching. I told him I would be there in an hour. He said to bring dosimeters. I said I always brought dosimeters. He said he knew that. He was just saying. I understood that he was saying he was afraid and did not know how to say it any other way. The drive out to Drumhaven in the pre-dawn dark was the kind of drive I had taken before 100 times. A narrow road through flat moorland. Frost on the verge, the first gray suggestions of light above the eastern ridge, where the sky was beginning to separate from the land. I had my case in the back seat, the good instruments, the ones I trusted. Portable Geiger unit with the calibrated probe, the dosimeters, the field notebook I had been keeping for 4 years at the establishment, which by then had the particular worn quality of something that has been opened and closed in conditions that were not gentle. I did not take the good instruments out for routine calls. The fact that I reached back and checked the case, latches twice on the drive out, told me something about what my hindbrain had already decided, regardless of what the rest of me was prepared to admit. The site was marked with military tape, and 2 very unhappy young corporals standing guard with their torches, and the specific look of men who have been told to guard something and have not been told what it is. There were lorry tracks in the mud where the ambulances had come and gone. In the middle of the field, maybe 40 meters from the road, the ground had split open. Not an explosion from above. I established that in the first 2 minutes. The torn edges of the fissure curled upward, the earth peeled back from itself, like the skin of a fruit cut from beneath. Whatever had done it had pushed from the inside. I stood at the edge with the Geiger unit and let it speak. The readings were extraordinary, not dangerous in the immediate sense. There was no spray of gamma at the lip of the fissure. Nothing that would have cooked me in place. But the quality of the signature was wrong, in a way that took me several minutes to identify and several more to accept. Natural radiation is chaos. It decays in statistical patterns that are random at the individual quantum level and average out to smooth curves over populations of events. What I was reading had structure, long intervals of low count, then bursts of precisely timed intensity at specific frequencies, then silence, then the pattern beginning again, as if the source were not simply decaying but broadcasting. I wrote it down in my field notebook. I recorded 3 complete repetitions. Before I trusted that I was reading what I was reading and not imposing a pattern on chaos, because I was tired and it was before dawn. and my brain was doing the thing brains do when they have not slept enough, which is to find meaning in noise. 3 repetitions. The pattern was consistent to the 3rd decimal place. Then Major Cartwright appeared at my shoulder, breath steaming in the cold morning, and asked me what I thought. I told him I thought we should rope off this field properly, and that nobody should come within 50 meters of the fissure without a full lead-line suit and a dosimeter that someone checked before they put it on. He told me his engineers had already been down the fissure with torches last night. I told him I would very much like to speak with those engineers. He said 2 of them were in the hospital in Lockmouth. I told him I needed to speak with the one who was not. The surviving engineer was a lance corporal named Webb, a Glasgow man, mid-20s, with a dry economy of expression and the specific look of someone who has seen something he has not yet found the architecture to describe. He met me at the edge of the tape line, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the fissure. Not the look of a frightened man exactly, the look of a man keeping a very careful account of something. He told me that when the ground split during the exercise, there had been a sound. Not an explosion in the conventional sense. He was specific about this, and I appreciated the precision. More like a compression wave, he said. Like someone had pushed all the air in a very large room through a very small gap at once. Then a sustained glow from below, amber and shifting, for perhaps 4 seconds. Not the flash of a detonation. Sustained and moving, then nothing. Then the burns on Lansing and the others. He paused. I waited, he said, and nothing came up out of it. I said, "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean, I was expecting something to come up. The glow was there, and then there was nothing there. And I keep thinking I should have seen something come up. Nothing did." He paused again. I waited again. Learned over 23 years of working with careful men that the pause before the last thing is usually the thing you came for, he said. But there was a moment where I thought something was looking up. I did not share that last piece with Cartwright. The Drumhaven Atomic Energy Establishment sat on the edge of the moor, 3 miles from the fissure site, and had been operating for 6 years by the time this began. I had been attached to it for 4 of those years. Technically as a civilian research consultant, practically as the person they called when something complicated and radioactive needed explaining to someone who was paying for it not to be dangerous. The director, John Elliott, a capable administrator who had the rare quality of trusting people who knew more than he did without resenting them for it. His son Peter was one of my junior researchers, a good mind still at the stage of believing that problems yield to sufficient data, which is a belief that experience eventually refines, but which is useful in its undamaged form. We had Cobalt-60 stores. We had a trinium research program. We had a reactor pile that I had designed the shielding for myself, and which I had been quietly proud of for 4 years. The establishment was a serious, quiet place doing serious, quiet work in the specific tone of institutions that know their purpose and are not anxious about it. The first sign that the establishment was involved came 4 days after the exercise. Peter came to my office at 7 in the morning with a face that was entirely the wrong color. Trinium sample from Laboratory 14, a sealed sample, lead-cased, locked in a shielded vault, with a combination that only 3 people at the establishment knew, had been drained overnight. Removed. Not stolen in any conventional sense. The combination lock was intact, the case was undamaged. The vault door was closed and sealed. The radioactivity had simply been extracted, through the case, through the lead, through the vault walls. What remained was an inert lump of metal with no more radioactive signature than a piece of cold pipe. At the base of the vault, and along the floor of the corridor outside, there was a soot-like residue. Black, very fine, the consistency of powdered graphite. I collected a sample in a sealed container and spent the rest of that morning with a spectroscope that told me the residue was not graphite, was not any carbon compound I could identify, and had trace electromagnetic signatures that I wrote in my field notebook without immediately knowing what to do with them. I looked at the vault. I looked at the residue. I thought about the patterned signal from the fissure. I thought about the quality of the burns on the soldiers. Not the acute tissue damage of a direct radiation exposure, which tends to be focal, but a diffuse whole-body effect consistent with immersion in a high-intensity electromagnetic field for a short duration, as if the field had passed through them, rather than struck them from a specific direction. I thought. It followed the radiation trail, 3 miles from the fissure to the establishment through the rock, along the electromagnetic gradient. It knows where the energy sources are. I did not say this to Peter. I said we needed more instruments, and we needed to establish a monitoring perimeter around the entire establishment, and I needed a full inventory of every radioactive source on the premises, checked against baseline readings. Shh. Peter looked at me for a moment and then went to organize it with the efficiency of someone who has not yet decided to be frightened, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Followed was 2 weeks of the most technically demanding and interpersonally exhausting work of my life, conducted against a backdrop of skepticism from Elliot, impatience from Cartwright, and the particular brand of bureaucratic authority wielded by McGill, the Atomic Energy Commission man, who the preface and demand at and that the situation would resolve itself if managed firmly. I had, in those 2 weeks, 17 incidents, drained radioactive sources at the establishment, the hospital radium in Lockmouth. The overnight nurse heard a static buzzing from the storage room and found the radium canister inert at dawn, the room covered in the same fine black residue, the diagnostic X-ray machine at the village surgery, a cobalt cache in our secondary laboratory that had been locked behind a steel door that was found untouched, the cobalt inert within. The hospital radium was the incident that sharpened my thinking most. The overnight nurse, a capable woman named Marion, who had worked at Lockmouth General for 12 years and was not given to exaggeration, told me that she had heard the static buzzing from the corridor for perhaps 3 minutes before it moved into the storage room. 3 minutes. She had stood at the junction of the corridor and listened to it, thinking initially that a piece of electrical equipment had developed a fault, before the static resolved itself into something closer to a tone, a sustained, precisely pitched resonance that she said made the hair on her forearms stand up. Then it had moved past her, through the wall of the corridor, into the radium storage, and the room had gone dark in its instruments and silent in its readings, and the residue had been on the floor in the morning. She had been standing in the corridor when it passed her, 2 meters, perhaps less, from the field of a being that had already killed 2 men at the Fisher site. And she was completely unharmed. The residue was in the storage room, not the corridor, not near Marion. I wrote in my field notes, discriminating, not simply hungry, choosing. Village surgery incident I turned over for days. Dr. Morrison, the GP, had had 2 patients in the waiting room that afternoon, a farmer and his wife, both in their 60s, sitting with back copies of a gardening magazine. The feeding had occurred at 2 in the morning, 8 hours after surgery closed. The entry point was the exterior wall facing the moor. Path of the residue showed a direct line from the entry wall to the X-ray machine and a direct line back, through the storage cupboard, past the prescription cabinet, past the wall of the waiting room. She had not gone into the waiting room. She had taken the radioisotope diagnostic compounds Morrison kept for specific procedures and left the morphine and the nitrous oxide untouched. She had gone to the radioactive sources and taken the minimum and left. I sat in Morrison's surgery for an hour that morning on one of the plastic chairs, and I thought about what it meant to be that precise. Not the blundering desperation of an instinctive organism following a gradient, something that had assessed the space and taken what it needed and left. The behavior was not predatory. It was not aggressive. It was the behavior of something in crisis trying to keep itself alive with whatever was available. In a world that had not answered its knock, each incident left the same residue. Each was preceded, when I lined up all my field readings against the incident timeline, by the same patterned signal from the fissure. The long intervals, the precise frequency bursts, the silence, 3 beats. The pattern was consistent across all 17 incidents, to a degree that was no longer coincidence and had not been coincidence since the 3rd. I began to think of it as a knock, something announcing itself, and then taking what it needed while the door stayed unanswered. But the more I looked at the incident patterns, the harder it was to maintain the word taking. She had gone where the radiation was. She had avoided the living when she could. She had taken the minimum. The behavior was the behavior of something in crisis, trying to keep itself alive, because no one had answered, and this was the part I could not write in the field notes because plain language was too large for the box the notes were supposed to fit. On the 14th night, 2 of Cartwright's soldiers went to the fissure and did not come back. Haggis and Webb posted as overnight sentries. Haggis because he was available, Webb because he had volunteered, having been the one who had been there on the first morning and apparently felt some kind of proprietary relationship to the site. 2 men in a jeep with rifles that would not have been worth anything against what was there, but which gave them the feeling of being armed, which is sometimes the best you can do. The dawn patrol found the jeep, found the rifles. Webb's had been dropped rather than set down. I looked at where it lay in the mud, and the angle of it told a clear story. Found the residue, spread across an area of perhaps 30 square meters, concentrated in 2 separate locations. Found a torn service cap that Cartwright identified as Haggis's by the regiment insignia. They did not find Webb and Haggis. Cartwright said very quietly, "I have my orders. We seal the fissure and we napalm the moor," I said. It came up through the last seal. The old survey records show this fissure was marked and sealed years ago after a similar incident, and nobody followed up because the records were filed and forgotten. Whatever is down there pushed through a concrete cap once. It will push through another, he said. Then we use more concrete, I said. You cannot concrete seal something that can pass through the concrete while the concrete is still liquid. The entity moves through solid matter by passing its electromagnetic field through the atomic structure. Physical barriers are not relevant to it, he said. Royce, I need to do something by morning. I understood what he meant. He had lost 2 men. He needed to act. The entire institutional architecture of the military exists to create the possibility of purposeful action in response to loss, and concrete and napalm was the action available to him. I did not blame him for wanting to use it. I said, "Give me 72 hours, he said. You have 48. 72. And I did not wait for him to agree. Back in my office at 2 in the morning, I opened the field notebook to the first entry from the fissure site, and I read it through from the beginning with the kind of attention that I could only give it in the quiet of that specific hour, when the establishment was silent, and the moor outside was dark and flat, and the weight of what I was trying to understand settled on me completely. Pattern signal. 17 incidents. The quality of the burns, diffuse, not focal. Precise 3-beat structure. The amber light that Webb had described, sustained and moving. The sense that something had been looking up. I wrote a single line at the bottom of the entries which I had not written before. It is communicating. And I wrote underneath. With whom? Then I went to the workshop and began to disassemble my neutralizer. The device had been 3 years in development. My own theoretical work, the contribution I had been most proud of, and most frustrated by, which is usually the same thing. A paired scanner system that could in principle generate a precisely calibrated counter-radiation field. Not a shield, not an absorber in the conventional sense, but an active destructive interference pattern that would strip energy from a radioactive source at the quantum level. The theory was sound. The Nobel Committee would not have been embarrassed by it. I allowed myself to think on good days. Practice was a recurring series of expensive explosions. The problem was alignment. 2 scanners had to be oriented with a phase relationship precise to within fractions of a degree, and this relationship could not be calculated in advance because the target source was not stationary. It was absorbing energy in real time, shifting its own electromagnetic state as it fed, and the calculated interference pattern had to track that shift in real time rather than imposing a fixed geometry. I had not solved this. I had been not solving it for 18 months with gradually decreasing optimism. I took the dubs apart component by component and laid everything on the workshop bench in the harsh white light of the 2:30 morning. And I looked at it the way you look at a thing when you have run out of the ability to not see what is wrong with it. Peter found me there at 5 when he came in early to resume the monitoring work. He stood in the doorway with his tea and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You're going to go down into it, aren't you?" I said. I need to understand the metabolic frequencies before I can calibrate the device for a controlled delivery. The only way to get accurate metabolic frequency data is proximity measurement, he said. That is not a no, said. I need you to help me reassemble this tonight, he said. It has a tendency to explode. Said we're going to fix that, he said. Father, I said. Peter. He put down his tea and came to the bench. Shh. We worked through the night. Webb appeared at 8 in the morning in civilian clothes, on medical leave, having received a telephone call from Elliot that Elliot later claimed I had asked him to make, which was partially true. I had said, in passing, that if Webb were available for voluntary engineering consultation, it might be useful, and Elliot had interpreted this with the latitude it required. Webb had the hands of a man who learned engineering in conditions where getting it wrong had immediate physical consequences, which is the best kind. The three of us worked in shifts through the 72 hours that Cartwright had not quite agreed to. In the 29th hour, working at the bench while Peter Alliant slept in my office and Webb dozed over the calibration notes, I found the alignment solution. I had been calculating the phase relationship at the source. I should have been calculating it at the receptor. The distinction sounds minor. It is not minor. It changes the entire approach to the feedback loop. Instead of projecting a fixed pattern and hoping the source accommodates it, you track the absorption event at the receptor surface and modulate the output in real time to match the actual absorption rate. The device does not impose. It responds. It follows the frequency of what it is feeding rather than dictating to it. Sat with this understanding for perhaps 4 minutes, very still, before I woke Peter. The corrected device ran its first test at 3 in the morning of the second day. Cobalt sample. Sealed container. The scanners hummed. The counter began to drop. Not catastrophically, not in the detonation curve that I had seen so many times that I had started to flinch in anticipation, but in a smooth declining arc, steady, controlled, 12 seconds from baseline activity to 0. The container was not warm. Peter said a word that I pretended not to hear, and then grabbed my forearm with both hands, which was all the commentary needed. On the morning of the 72nd hour, I descended into the fissure, not the full-scale device that came later. I went down with the portable unit, stripped to its essential component, my instruments, and the dictaphone that I had been using for field recording since the beginning. The winch line, 40 meters of it, with Peter at the controls and Webb monitoring the dosimeter relay at the surface. The morning was cold, and the moor was wet from overnight rain, and the fissure opening looked the same as it had. Looked on the first morning, the torn edges of the earth still curled upward, weathered now by 2 weeks of Scottish autumn. I have been asked afterward whether I was afraid going down. The honest answer is that I was very focused, which is the state I go to when fear is present but not useful. I was thinking about the probe calibration and the dictaphone battery life, and whether the phase tracking in the portable unit was stable enough for the readings I needed. And these thoughts occupied the foreground of my mind in the way that technical problems do when you are inside them. Fear was there. It was behind the technical problems, not absent. The descent took 9 minutes. The rock walls of the fissure were black and wet, the temperature rising steadily as I went down. And 40 meters below the surface, the fissure widened into a chamber, perhaps 4 meters across, with a floor of compacted mineral matter and a ceiling of fractured rock. The air was dense with something that was not quite heat and not quite radiation, and was both. The dosimeter was reading high, but not lethal, which had been my estimate from the surface data. And then the light, amber and shifting, as Webb had described on that first morning. But to describe it simply as light is insufficient. It was organized. A column of luminous matter, perhaps 2 meters in height, hanging in the chamber with a coherence that did not belong to a natural phenomenon. It was not a flame, which is turbulent, and it was not bioluminescence, which is passive. It was something that was emitting in a controlled and deliberate way, the way a searchlight is controlled and deliberate, except the control was internal to the thing itself, and it was pulsing. The long intervals of low intensity, the bursts of precisely timed brightness, 3 beats, silence, 3 beats. The pattern I had been reading in the field notebook for 2 weeks. Pressed record on the dictaphone and I said, "I am here, I can hear you." I do not have a precise description of what happened in the seconds after I said that, because what happened was a change in quality rather than a change in kind, and in quality are difficult to record instrumentally. Pulsing stopped. There was a stillness that was not merely the absence of the signal but had its own character. The stillness of something that has been broadcasting and has just registered something on the other end. Then a single burst, very bright, very precisely timed. Then the pattern again, but different, slower, more deliberate. The way you speak more carefully when you are suddenly aware that someone is listening, I said. I have instruments. I am going to record the pattern precisely. I need you to repeat it. The light repeated it. Exactly. I spent 4 hours in that fissure. I will not try to reconstruct all of it here, because most of what happened in those 4 hours was the slow, painstaking work of recording and correlating electromagnetic data, with no guarantee that the correlations were meaningful. What I can tell you is what I understood at the end of those 4 hours. The entity communicated in electromagnetic frequencies modulation, not language. I have to be precise about that because the word language carries connotations that do not apply. Symbols, not grammar. Structured signal, with a consistency and pattern complexity that could not be explained by any non-cognitive mechanism I was aware of. Patterns that corresponded reliably to states. I identified 3 in the first session. Hunger. A specific sequence, rapid and slightly ragged, that I recognized immediately because it was the most frequent signal in my 2 weeks of surface data. The entity had been broadcasting this pattern repeatedly in the days preceding every incident at the establishment and in the village. Pain. A longer, more irregular sequence with degraded precision, as if the control required to produce clean signals was being compromised by the physical state producing the signal. I had not seen this pattern in the surface data, which meant it was new, which meant the metabolic situation was deteriorating, and a third pattern, which I encountered for the first time in that fissure and which I spent longer with than either of the other 2. It came at moments of specific interaction, when I spoke, when I adjusted the instruments, when I moved, not randomly, in response to me, specifically. A long, clear, unhurried sequence that had the quality of deliberate attention. I climbed back up at noon. At the surface, Peter helped me off the winch line and looked at my face and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. I stood on the moor for a moment in the thin October daylight, listening to the wind. Then I went to find Cartwright. He was in the establishment's conference room with McGill and Elliot and 2 of his junior officers. I came in without knocking, which I do not usually do, and I put my field notebook on the table and said, I need more time. I need you to stand down the assault until I can configure the device correctly. Cartwright said, my orders come from London. We seal and destroy, I said. You cannot destroy her. Silence after that sentence had a particular quality. Cartwright said, very carefully, her, I said. The entity is intelligent. The electromagnetic pattern is a communication system. I have been recording its signals for 2 weeks, and I have now made direct contact. She is not a hazard. She is a living being in metabolic crisis. And the attacks on the establishment and the village were not aggression. They were desperation. She was starving, and she was going where the food was. And nobody was listening when she tried to announce herself first. Elliot said, Royce, I said, I know how it sounds. I have the field data. You can have all of it. What I am telling you is that there is a mind down there, and it has been alone in the rock of this planet for longer than human civilization has existed. And it woke up hungry and in pain. And the first thing it did was knock on the door. Gil said, from the end of the table, and nobody answered. I said, nobody answered. The room was quiet for a while. Cartwright said, even if I accept everything you are saying, Royce, and I am not saying I do, I have orders. I have 2 dead men. I cannot, I said. I know what you cannot do. I am asking for 72 hours to give you an alternative to those orders. If I cannot demonstrate a stable feeding protocol in 72 hours, you can proceed. If I succeed, you have a solution that does not require you to explain to London why there is a radioactive crater in the middle of a populated moorland. Gill said, that is a reasonable position. Cartwright looked at McGill. He looked at me. He looked at the field notebook on the table. He said, 72 hours, Royce, not a minute more. The next 3 days in the workshop were a different kind of difficult from the first three. The technical problem was largely solved. What remained was calibration. Not the theoretical calibration, which I had, but the applied calibration, which required knowing the specific metabolic frequencies of this specific entity rather than the generalized electromagnetic parameters of my test samples. I had partial data from the field recordings. I did not have enough. I needed to go back down. Peter and I argued about this with the specific quality of an argument between people who are not arguing about what they say they are arguing about. He said the calibration was sufficient. I said it was not. He said the risk profile of a second descent was not justified by the marginal improvement in calibration accuracy. I said it was. He said, "You want to go back?" I said, "I need to go back." He said, "Those are not the same thing." I said, "No, they are not." I descended the second time the next morning. The weather had closed in overnight, and the moor was wrapped in a low gray mist that reduced the view from the fissure lip to perhaps 20 meters. The cold was the specific damp cold of a Scottish autumn that works through a jacket rather than against it, settling in the joints and the back of the neck. Webb had the winch running before I arrived, which told me he had been there since before dawn, which told me he understood what we were trying to do that morning, and had decided, in the private way that practical men make decisions, that he was going to be useful regardless of whether anyone had formally asked him. The full-scale device was rigged on a lowering cradle that Webb had designed overnight, a clean piece of engineering that distributed the weight of the unit evenly across the winch line and allowed for one-handed adjustment of the scanner array. Peter came down with me this time. I had not asked him to come, and he had not asked permission. He simply put on the harness, and I did not send him back. The amber light was there. The recognition pattern, the third one, the one I had called recognition, came immediately, before I had spoken, before I had activated any instrument. It was the same pattern I had recorded in the first session, precisely, and it came as an immediate response to my presence in the chamber, not to Peter's presence. I noted that in the field record later, very carefully, that the signal had come force Peter descended fully, and that it had the specific directionality of the recognition sequence I had been building a map of for 2 weeks, oriented toward me. Peter said quietly, "It knows you," I said. "Yes." He said nothing more about it. He was a scientist. He opened the absorption monitor and began calling numbers. We spent 90 minutes in the fissure. Peter read the absorption data, the real-time metabolic rates that I needed to track with the phase adjustment, and called numbers in a flat, professional voice that I was grateful for, because the emotion of the situation was not something either of us was going to discuss in a fissure 40 meters underground. And the numbers gave us a shared vocabulary that was sufficient to the task. I adjusted the output, tracked the absorption, modulated. The hunger sequence diminished, slowly, then faster as the calibration found its footing, then stopped. I held the output steady for several minutes, watching the absorption rate in the monitor, making minute adjustments to track the metabolic shift. This was the work, not the theory, not the argument with Cartwright, not the descent itself, but this, sitting in the heat of a chamber 40 meters underground, when the light around you and the numbers coming in and your hands on the controls, doing the small, precise corrections that move the reading in the direction you need it to go. This was the work I had been trained for and the work I was good at, and I was grateful, in that moment, to be exactly where the work was. Pain sequence continued for a long time. Degraded, irregular, the signal of a system under serious strain. I kept adjusting. The absorption rates shifted. Pain sequence began to change, its precision returning slowly, like a signal coming through static. 80 minutes into the session, the pain sequence stopped. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Then the recognition signal, very long, very clean. Then a pause. Then a new element at the end. Something I had not recorded before. A short 3-beat sequence in a different frequency register from anything in my catalog. I said, "I hear that. I will work out what it means." Peter said nothing. When I looked at him in the ambered light, he had the expression of someone watching a thing they have not got the frame for yet. We climbed out. Webb pulled the cradle up behind us. I stood at the lip of the fissure in the rain for a moment, the moor stretching flat and gray in every direction. And I thought about what it meant that the recognition signal had come before I spoke, before I moved, before I activated anything. It had known me by something other than what I was doing. It had known me by what I was. I went to find Cartwright. He was in the conference room again. Elliot was there, and McGill and Peter came in behind me still in his field gear, and I put the calibration data on the table and told them the protocol was stable. Cartwright said, "Show me." I described the 90 minutes in the fissure. I described the hunger signal dropping and stopping. I described the pain signal changing. I described the new element at the end that I had not decoded yet. McGill said, "And your interpretation is that the feeding protocol is sustainable?" "Indefinitely," I said. "With a monthly maintenance schedule, yes. The geological flux at the fissure depth is insufficient for baseline sustenance, but it is sufficient for maintenance above the threshold I fed her to this morning. Monthly top-up controlled frequency delivery, monitored by my device. The metabolic crisis ends, the hunting ends," Cartwright said. "And if you don't maintain the schedule," I said, "then she degrades back toward crisis and the hunting resumes, which is why the schedule is not optional." Cartwright said, "London will not fund this indefinitely." I said, "London will fund it, or I will write a detailed account of this incident for the scientific community and the general public, and we can discuss the funding question in that forum." McGill made the small sound again that might have been a laugh. Cartwright looked at me for a long time. He had the look of a man who has just understood that the situation he is inside is larger than the orders he was given for it. He said, "You are absolutely certain she is intelligent?" I said, "I am absolutely certain," he said. "And she communicated with you, specifically with you?" I said. "The recognition signal was present before I activated any instrument on my second descent, before I moved, before I spoke. It came as an immediate response to my presence, which means she had stored the pattern of my presence from the first session and recognized it on the second," Elliot said quietly. "She was waiting for you to come back." I said yes. The room was quiet. Trite said, "Stand down the assault. I'll call London." I said nothing. I had said what needed saying. What followed was 3 years of monthly descents, and this is the part of the account that the official record handles least honestly. The official record describes a monitoring program, a maintenance protocol, a series of instrument readings and calibration sessions conducted at the fissure site under the Drumhaven establishment's oversight. It is accurate. It is also, and I have spent years deciding how to say this, incomplete in the way that a medical record of a friendship is incomplete. Facts are there. The meaning of the facts is absent. The first year Peter came with me on all 12 sessions. He was rigorous and thorough, and his presence was genuinely useful for the calibration work. And sometime around the 7th month, he stopped pretending that the calibration was the primary reason. He came and started asking me questions about what I thought the recognition signal meant. We had long conversations on the drive back to the establishment. And Peter was one of the few people in my professional life with whom I could think out loud without arriving at a conclusion I later regretted. By the end of the first year, the metabolic reading showed steady improvement above baseline. The pain signal was absent from every session. The hunger signal appeared briefly at the start of each session and dropped to 0 within the first 20 minutes of feeding. The new element, the 3-beat sequence in the unfamiliar frequency register that I had first heard on the second descent, appeared at the end of every session after the main feeding in the same position each time. I had been trying to decode it for 8 months when I arrived at a working hypothesis in the middle of a very ordinary Thursday, eating a sandwich at my desk, looking out at the moor. It was a response to my departure statement. I said I'll be back at the end of every session. The new element always came after that. Always and only after that. I wrote in my field notebook, hypothesis. The 3-beat sequence is a response to the departure statement, possible interpretation, acknowledgement, or confirmation of receipt. Then I wrote, possible interpretation, I know. Then I put the notebook down and looked out at the moor for a while. The second year, Peter's visits became less frequent, as the calibration work required his contribution less directly. And by the middle of the second year, I was descending alone. I had not sought this, and I had not avoided it. It had arrived naturally, as things do, when they are the right shape for the situation. Alone in the chamber, with the amber light and the instruments and the dictaphone. The sessions had a quality that I find difficult to describe without sounding like something other than what I am, which is a physicist. What I can say is this. The recognition signal had evolved over 2 years of monthly contact. It was longer, more complex. It had developed internal variation, not new content, exactly, but texture. The way a piece of music has texture that its notation does not fully capture. I was not, by any standard I would defend in a professional publication, receiving information. I was receiving something, and it was arriving in the specific register of something addressed to me, rather than broadcast generally. On the 26th session, 2 years and 2 months into the program, the new element, the 3-beat departure response, appeared not at the end of the session, but at the beginning, before I had said anything, before I had activated the device. I sat with that for the rest of the session. On the drive back, I thought about what it would mean for a being whose entire mode of communication was electromagnetic signal, who had no body in any conventional sense, who experienced time at a geological scale rather than a biological one. What it would mean for such a being to broadcast the acknowledgement of a departure before the departure had been stated. The only interpretation I could construct that fit the data was this. She was telling me that she already knew I was going to leave, and that she already knew I would come back, and that the statement of these facts at the start of the session, rather than the end, was a way of saying that the leaving and the returning had become a single thing. The arc of it was complete in advance. There was no uncertainty to acknowledge at the end because the end was already understood from the beginning. I wrote in my field notebook, "She has learned the pattern of how I work." Then I wrote, "She trusts the pattern." Then I stopped writing and drove the rest of the way back to the establishment in the particular silence of a conclusion that does not need to be discussed. The formal program ended in the 4th year. The commission data supported a finding of stable metabolic function and negligible risk profile, and the institutional appetite for continued funding of a monitoring program at a quiet moorland site with no incidents in 3 years was, predictably, limited. Cartwright had retired. McGill sent me a brief, formal letter of commendation. Elliot and I published 3 papers in the academic journals, carefully worded to describe electromagnetic anomalies at a geological formation without attributing cognition to the source. Because the attribution of cognition would have required explanations that neither of us was prepared to make in public at that time, I stayed at Drumhaven on my own arrangement, my own funding, technically, which amounted to my salary from the establishment, minus the cost of the monthly fuel and the device maintenance. Elliot approved the continued site access without asking me to justify it, which was one of the things I valued most about John Elliot. The visits continued. Monthly through the 4th year and the 5th and the 6th. The amber light was always there. The recognition signal was always immediate. The feeding took less time each year as the geological flux in the deep rock gradually recovered. The planet's own heat coming back to what it had been before the geological disruption that had trapped her down there. A slow restoration across decades. By the 8th year, the hunger signal was barely present at all at the start of sessions. A flicker, gone within minutes of activation. I was spending each session, proportionally, in the presence of the recognition signal, and the departure response and the texture I could not quite describe, and less in the work of metabolic emergency response. I was, in the practical sense, visiting rather than treating. On the 31st visit, 10 years after the beginning, I descended to find the fissure changed. A minor geological shift had widened the chamber slightly, and the column of amber light was lower. Closer to the floor, its distribution different. Color had a blue cast I had not seen before. I ran my calibration checks and found no cause for concern. The metabolic readings were the best I had ever recorded, the cleanest and most stable signal in 10 years of field data. The recognition signal came before I was fully settled on the chamber floor. And then, at the end of the session, after I had said what I always said, "I'll be back," something happened that was not in any of my previous field recordings. The departure response came. The 3-beat acknowledgement that I had been hearing for nearly 10 years. And then, after a pause, a new signal, not in the frequency register of anything I had cataloged. Long and very precise, with an internal structure that I spent an hour recording and another hour trying to map against everything I had accumulated. Could not decode it. Not that day. On the drive back, I turned it over from every angle I could reach, and I did not arrive anywhere satisfying. And I filed it under unknown, and went back to the establishment and ate dinner and slept well, which was either evidence that I was at peace with uncertainty or evidence that I was very tired, probably both. 2 weeks later, at my desk at 2 in the morning, with the field notebook open and the dictaphone transcriptions spread across the desk, I arrived at an interpretation that I have held carefully for the 12 years since. The new signal had come after the departure response, after the acknowledgement of the pattern of leaving and returning in its frequency register. Not hunger, not pain, not recognition in the familiar sense, was a register I had encountered before in the data, briefly, in the sessions of the first year, in the moments when something in the feeding session had gone unexpectedly well, in the moments after a calibration correction that had produced a particularly clean result, the register of something that was not neutral, something that was not simply the absence of distress. I wrote in my field notebook, hypothesis, the new signal is an expression of a state that is the counterpart of pain, not simply the absence of pain, the positive counterpart. Then I wrote, the closest English word I can find is ease. Then I wrote, or perhaps the word is well. Then I wrote, or perhaps what she was saying is what you say when someone who has been coming back for 10 years asks how you are, and you mean it when you answer. I closed the notebook. I thought about Webb, who had stood at the lip of a fissure, with a rifle that meant nothing, and had told me afterward, with a flatness that did not hide what it was hiding, that he had thought something was looking up. I thought about Haggis, who I never met, whose service cap was the only thing the Dawn Patrol found. I thought about Cartwright, who had 2 dead men and 48 hours of patience, and who had, when it came to it, stood down the assault. I thought about the fact that for 1 million years approximately, a mind had lived in the crust of this planet, alone in the dark and the heat, and that the atomic age had woken it up into a world of noise and radiation, and concrete, and flamethrowers, and that the first thing it had done was try to knock on the door. I thought about what it means to be the one who answers. The final formal entry in my field notebook, the last one I will write for the official record, whenever that record is eventually made available to the people it belongs to, is dated a March morning of the 11th year. The moor was thin with spring light, and the fissure was the same as it had always been. The torn earth weathered, now, to something almost natural, almost as if it had always been there. The winch was still in place, a permanent installation by that point, and the rigging Webb had designed in those urgent 72 hours had held up through 11 winters without significant wear. I descended for the last time as a formally documented researcher. The amber light was there. The recognition signal came before I was fully settled. The feeding was brief, barely needed now, barely more than a courtesy exchange. The device running for 12 minutes before the hunger signal, already at its lowest baseline, dropped to nothing. Then the long, clear recognition. Then the departure response. Then the new signal, the one I had decoded as ease or well or something in that neighborhood, the positive counterpart to pain, longer this time, richer, with the complexity I had not heard before. I sat in the chamber for a while after the signal ended, not taking readings. Just sitting. I said, I'll be back. 3-beat response came, then silence. Then something very brief, very precisely timed. A single beat. A different register from everything else, from every signal in 10 years of field recordings. I recorded it, and I listened to it for a long time afterward without arriving at a formal interpretation. Closest I could come was this. It had the quality of a thing said simply, not as information, not as signal in the communicative sense, but as presence, as the electromagnetic equivalent of a hand placed briefly on a table in the dark, not to transmit anything, but to confirm that both hands are in the same room. I climbed the winch line for the last formal time. The March cold was a clear shock after the heat of the chamber, and the moor was very quiet. The kind of quiet that is held rather than empty. I stood at the lip of the fissure for a moment, with the spring sky overhead and the smell of wet earth and the particular feeling of ending something that has not ended, which is the feeling of anything that continues past its formal boundaries. I walked back to the car. I put the instruments in the boot. I drove the 3 miles back to Drumhaven, and I did not look back at the fissure because I did not need to. I knew it was there. She knew I was coming back, and that was the same fact stated twice, and it was enough. Is a version of this story in which I am described as the scientist who solved the Drumhaven crisis, who identified the electromagnetic mechanism and developed the neutralization device, and prevented the military assault that would have accomplished nothing. That version is accurate and insufficient. The thing I solved was not the crisis. The crisis would have resolved itself eventually, either through a military action that detonated the fissure site and left a radioactive scar on the Scottish moorland that would have been difficult to explain, or through some other accommodation that someone else might have reached if not me. Crisis was solvable. Crises generally are. What I did was answer the knock. That is a smaller thing in some ways and a larger thing in others. It required no particular genius. It required only the decision not to look away from what the data was showing me, which was that the signal had structure, and structure means intent, and intent means a mind, and a mind alone in the dark for 1,000,000 years, knocking on a door that nobody has answered, deserves to have the door opened. I have thought, sometimes about whether she understood, in any way I could call understanding, what it meant that a human came. One human specifically. Not an institution, not a program, not a monitored maintenance schedule. Those came later, and she accommodated them. But the recognition signal when the institutional schedule proceeded without me had a different quality than the recognition signal when I descended. And I noted the difference in the field records, and did not speculate about it in those records because speculation without data is not field record material. I speculate about it now. She had been alone for 1,000,000 years. She had communicated in the only frequency she had. She had knocked on a door that had been until a specific October morning in a specific Scottish moorland, made of solid earth. She did not know that anyone would answer. She could not have known. She had broadcast into the dark for the entirety of her adult existence, which was, by my estimate, the entirety of human civilization and then some, without receiving anything back, and then something answered. And the something came back, and came back again. I think that is not a small thing to her. I think that is the main thing. I cannot prove this. I can only report that the signal is different when I am the one descending, and that the difference has a quality that my instruments record, and that I experience in the chamber as something I do not have a professional vocabulary for, and have therefore mostly kept out of the formal record. I experience it as being known, not observed, not monitored, known. That is all I can tell you. That is the honest record. Some things do not need to be witnessed to be real. Some things just need to be kept.